Okay, it should have some sound now. Please let me know if there is any sound.
What sound but lovely chest.
Hey, there we go. Yeah, I'm switching things on my computer so it's all sort of set up. Hey, yes, there it is. Cool. Let me see if this was working. It may, and the sound will probably not be in sync with my movement today due to other issues with the system. So I'll try and fix that, or I'll try not to show my mouth so much so that it looks like everything's perfectly fine. All of the fun of technology. So today we are doing inlaid dovetails, and if you don't know what that is, go look at the video I put out on Saturday. I made a box with inlaid dovetails, and it looks like the dovetails are outlined, and they're outlined with a different wood. Commonly it's done with contrasting woods, so walnut and maple. But I really like the contrast of walnut, particularly air-dried walnut where you get all the colors, and white oak. With the end grain of the white oak and the medullary rays coming through, it's really kind of cool. So that's what we're going to be working on today. I'm hoping we can get through an entire joint today, but that's going to be really close. I may end up saying, yeah, let's call this off. Do half the joint today and half the joint tomorrow because or not tomorrow, but next week, because it is it's a joint that looks very complicated, and it can be if you overthink it. It's just it's a long joint to do. It takes a lot of steps to get there. And so that's kind of one of the things that turns it off. But basically, if you can cut hand-cut dovetails, you can cut inlaid dovetails. It's just doing it again with a few other specialties. I glued this piece on the end because we're going to be doing, if I can get to all of it today, we'll do half of it on one end and then the other half on the other, so I don't have to wait for the glue to dry. So let's actually dive in to cutting in on the walnut. And I'm going to be splicing it in with this piece of white oak. Switch over cameras. It's always this time of week I think, wow, I wish I had a cameraman. The first thing I want to do on this, or camera woman, yes. The first thing I want to do in this is I actually want to cut a rebate along here. Since I'm doing this for the Europeans, this is a rebate. If you're doing it in America, it's a rabbit. And what this allows you to do is it creates on the dovetails. It actually outlines the dovetails on both sides. If you don't put a rebate in here, you're looking at from one side they're outlined, and the other side it just looks like normal dovetails. So some people call it doing it a double inlaid dovetail. But actually a doubled inlaid dovetail is where you have multiple lines on the other side. And we'll talk about that when we get closer to the end. But the first thing I want to do is actually create a rebate. First thing I need to do is find my marking gauge, which is missing. There, marking gauge. Found it. So I want to set up the marking gauge to be that's not the marking gauge I want. I want this marking gauge. I want to set up the marking gauge to be the thickness of the board. So you can see how that is set up on there. And I want to put an outline on here. And I'm going to go all the way around the board. So this is really looking a lot like regular dovetails. This is the depth cut. But then this is also the depth of the rabbet as that all comes into it. So mark all the way around the board. And now I want to cut out an 1/8 inch down by the width of that rabbet. And so I have this set up to be the thickness of the board minus an 1/8 inch. So this will actually put a line an 1/8 inch away from that end. The reason I don't put it at 1/8 inch is it's really close to it and it causes some issues with the marking gauge sometimes. So sometimes it's better to go the opposite direction. So there we got that. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me. There. So that is the rabbet that we need to cut out. An 1/8 inch down and the thickness of the board away from the edge here. And this cut here really scares some people for some reason, and I'm not 100% sure why. But I like to actually just set it up in here and cut it with a saw. Ooh, there we go. Different people are going to cut it different ways. You can use a chisel and chop down. And so I could just come in with the chisel, set it at that height, and chop down. But the chisel has a tendency to move back as it slides in. And so I thought this would also be a good opportunity to show how to do it with a saw. as that is a very easy way of doing it, especially if it's on a wider board. The saw is a little bit faster than the chisel. So I'm just going to make that cut in a little deeper, put it in a knife wall. Knife wall will help the saw stay in place. Not as necessary on a thinner board like this, but if I were doing it on a larger piece like I did for the box, where I'm cutting across like a 10-inch wide or an 18-inch wide board, the knife wall makes it a lot easier for the saw to fit in. I'm going to grab my carcass saw, and I'm just going to let it sit in that knife wall, let it slide easily. It's just going to take a couple passes to get down to that depth. Close, a little more on the backside. Down to depth, down to depth. That's all we need. Now I can come in with the mallet, the chisel, and a mallet. And I want to chop in that shoulder. I'm going to come down about halfway to the line. Tap it. That's a little more than halfway, but close enough. About halfway to the line. Down about halfway to the line. And then I'm going to come in and put it right on that line. And pare it out. This one I may have to tap with the mallet. Yeah, a little hard there. Trying to take off a bigger chunk than I should. Speeding up a little bit to try and get this done today. Set it in here. Right back into there. I'm just going to check my marking gauge on the side, make sure everything's clean. And then sometimes I'll come in with a router plane. Just make sure that everything is copacetic. Aesthetocopic. Lift it up a little bit. Down just a hair. Yeah, let's clean that up a little bit. And when you're climbing on this, I want to have all my force pushing down on this handle. And this one I just grab lightly like this. Just let it scratch the top. Because a lot of times you have a tendency to push down on this side, and that's going to make you cut deeper over here. We don't want to do that. I think that's about it. There. We have our ribbit. Or a rabbit. Next thing we want to do is cut some dovetails on here. And at this point, everything looks fairly similar to any other way we've cut dovetails. So I'm going to put this into the vise. Move that camera over here a little bit so you guys can see a little better. Any questions?
Nada.
It's probably going to be a little bit quieter in the live chat today. But part of that's just due to European people tend to be a little quieter. Set this one up a little bit too. There we go. And now the question comes, where's my square? How do I want to lay out these dovetails? And some people are going to be really picky how they lay out their dovetails. Some people are going to not be picky. I tend to be more in the second line. In the video I recently did, I was using the Cat's Moses jig. I really like this one because this guarantees that all of my cuts are going to be at the same angle and I don't have to make any of the marking lines to follow. Makes it a little faster, and for the tool, for the box I was making, it was very important that all the dovetails be identical. So I used this. But most of the time I'm just going to do them freehand. Move some things out of the way. I want to set up where I want these to be. So I'm going to put a mark here. That's my tail. I'm going to put a mark here. Oops, other way. Right there. I don't really care exactly where these are. I'm just going to do them by eye. Let's do something like there and there. Let's see, how does that look? Yeah, a little big. Let's make that a little smaller. So I'm just kind of playing with it. And if anything, when you're doing inlaid dovetails, you want the tails, or excuse me, you want your pins to be a little bigger than normal because you're going to be filling that in and cutting them out. But in this case, I'm going to make tails really, really big because I want to emphasize that a little bit. It's going to be a little different. Then I'm going to set my saw in here. And when I'm using the cat's Moses jig, a lot of times I'll do a single pass, get that little kerf in there. That way I can put the saw in there, bring the gauge up into it, and let the saw then connect with it once it's in place. But when I'm just doing freehand, I'm just going to do it freehand. Just like that. You know what, I'm going to recut that one. I don't like that one as much. Let's cut that one at that angle. That looks better.
When you're ready, I got a couple questions.
Okay. You just go for it.
Who makes the dovetail guide that you're using?
This is Cat's Moses. If you actually go to the last video I had where I'm making the box, I have a link to it. It's Cat's Moses Woodworking. He has a YouTube channel and he does a lot of really funky dovetails and things like that. And he'll do like triple and quadruple inlaid dovetails. Look really cool. Ton of work though. Ton of work. There. Before the next question, now that we've cut down all of our grooves here, I'm going to cut off the outside here. That looks pretty easy. Just set that up in this and cut down horizontally. If I'm using the jig, I can also do the exact same thing again because there's a 90-degree side, so I can use that on there. What else we got?
Where did it go? Back to Forest. What did you do before you became a YouTube star?
Well, isn't that what I'm doing right now? I don't think I've made it that far yet. I am and was a stay-at-home dad. I worked in theater. I did technical theater. My undergrad was in counseling. My master's is in technical theater. And what's that?
You married me.
Yes. Yes. But I've done a thousand things in my life. Woodworking
He was
is
a realtor for a while.
just one, yeah. I used to teach at a college. I taught welding. I didn't teach. I was a supervisor of a metal shop at a theater. Just want to clean these up while I'm here, so I can still see that line. And up to this point, other than that rabbit, everything we're doing is just a normal dovetail. And so, if you're having questions so far, I have several videos on making dovetails that'll probably answer those questions. There we go. Now, I can get out the junk in between here. And so to do that, I'm going to use me hold fast, which is missing. Where did my hold fast go? Hold fast. Oh, there it is. I thought I put it out, apparently.
Are you ready for another question?
Sure.
Jaredsbanta asks, any recommendations on what type of saw to cut the dovetail? I can't quite stretch the budget and buy the Nielson or veritas saw at the moment.
If you can't afford a veritas saw, I usually tell people a hacksaw, which sounds ridiculous. But a hacksaw actually has pretty decent teeth. As long as you don't get a blade that has the wavy teeth, hacksaws actually are a surprisingly good dovetail saw. Now, they're not very good for most joinery, but for small things like dovetails, they actually work really well. Usually the cheap-end budget saw is the veritas saw. That's about as cheap as they get and still are decent quality. But yeah, you'd be amazed what you can actually get done with a hacksaw. So I'm just chopping in and then paring out, getting into this tooth. If you ever watched any of my dovetail videos before, you know exactly what I'm doing here. But here, I'll turn this back on while I'm doing that. So now I've gotten close, I'm going to go back into that line, chop it down. and chop it down. Hey. Now let's flip it over and remove the rest of it. And when there's the rabbet on here, I want to actually chop it out rabbet side down first. That way when I flip it over, there's still something supporting the wood here so I can have a nice solid chop for those last couple. If I don't, then my last couple will actually be breaking it off as the rabbet. There's nothing supporting on the other side of the wood. Any other questions?
So Laura from TheKiddSocks asks, I'm extremely new to woodworking and have almost no tools. But I may be able to get my hands on some walnut from a friend. What is a good beginner project to make from walnut?
A good beginner project is whatever project interests you. And walnut is a really versatile wood, especially when you're working with hand tools. You really can't go wrong. I guess it just depends on how big you want to make. I mean, a coffee table is a really nice piece of furniture and a lot of joinery that goes together pretty quickly. So usually like a coffee table or a side table is a great first project. But some people that's a bit too scary, so then something as simple as like a cutting board or a bird feeder or a bird house. But a lot of times, making your first tools, making your first mallet, making winding sticks, things like that. And I have a playlist. On projects that I consider beginner projects. So if you want to take a look at that, that is up there. What is off with that? Okay, well let's figure this out.
Excuse me.
This is the fun of a live, is we have something here is off. And so what I'm actually going to do is let you guys see this. I'm going to use my square and put it across here, and particularly this outside face is the important face. Is that off? Oh, that's why. I didn't shoot this end of the board. I forgot to do that. So this end of the board is actually tipped a little bit that way. And so because I marked down from there, this back edge is tipped. And there's a gap in front here. Same gap there. Same gap there. So I need to clean that up. And I'm just going to come in with a chisel and pare down that amount of a gap. And I'm just kind of doing it by eye. But by eye is like a 32nd of an inch. So actually probably less than that, probably on close to a 64th. And that side is good there. And because we have that shoulder, bring this back around this way, we need to work on focusing. There we go. All the way across on the shoulder on the back. And if you have questions about how much you should actually take off less and then come back to that, because you can always take off more, but at a certain point you just can't take off any less. If that makes any sense. Fixing problems. If I was smart, I would have checked that ahead of time. And I shot the other end, I used the shooting board on the other end, but forgot to do it on this end. So, oh well, such is life. That's a lot of the fun of woodworking, or in this case, shooting things live. Now let's see how that looks. Okay, there. Now we're flat all the way across there. Check the same all the way across there, and all the way across there. And that way now, when this board gets ready to socket into that, everything goes together a lot smoother. So let's actually look at the next step in dovetails. Can I ask a question? Sure.
Excuse me, J. Stu asked, any recommendations on how to learn about the different woods to use in woodworking?
Use them. that sounds really annoying, but in all honesty, the only way you're ever going to learn about a wood, particularly with hand tools, is to use it. And yes, you can get ideas by looking at what their grain structure is and how dense they are and silica content and things like that. But really that's not going to translate to actual use until you have an experience with other woods that you can kind of compare it to. And you can say, oh, that one's more grainy than this wood, or that one's more difficult to work with than the other wood. Really, yeah, there really isn't a great way other than using it. So, sorry. Oh, I'm gonna have to lift this one up. I didn't think about that. Most of the time, I don't have this other block on the other end, but I have that on there because it's already been pre-glued up, so we can get to that a little later. But what I want to do is lift this up, lift it up until this is at 90. And because I have that rabbet on there, this actually fits in really nicely. And it makes it much easier to hold in place because the rabbet holds this in, so all I have to do is keep this up against the board. So I'm going to bring this to that height, lock it down, put that in there. And so now all I have to do is hold it in place and transfer the marks from this to this. Any questions?
Yes, Laura from TheKiddSocks asks, do you have any book recommendations that aren't too heavy in lingo or at least explains terminology, as I'm completely self-taught?
I honestly don't read books much. I've read a lot of them, but most of them tend to be the deeper books and harder things to figure out. I don't learn well from reading, and so therefore books for me are really difficult and worthless. I learn by doing, and so I usually go on YouTube and I see like 5 or 6 different methods, and then I'll come down to the shop and I'll play with those methods and find the one that works best for me. I'm, as to hand tools, pretty much self-taught. I've learned from a few other people, and woodworking in general I've learned from my father and several other people. But as to hand tools, YouTube is where I generally go to. I'm like, how do I do that? I'll go and look at a few other ideas and usually base that off of several of them. And usually I'm going to find a method that I like that other people haven't used, just because I'm a little twisted. But that's me.
We did a series where I was a very beginner to some things. And for terminology, if you watch the lives, I ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, but really, yeah, watching videos is very helpful, I feel like.
Cool. Well, the next thing is we use the marking gauge here to mark how deep this rabbet was. And I'm going to use that to actually mark around this board to know how far down to cut. So however thick the leftover from the rabbet is how much I need to take out of this material. So I'm going to use that same marking gauge, and I'm going to go across here and across here. And this is my stop cut for the saw. So the saw cuts down to that depth. And before I go any farther, I'm going to learn from my past mistakes and make sure, yes, that is square. Is it square this way too? Yes, it's square that way too. I shot that one. Oh well. And because I have those in there, now I can pinch it. And I'm pinching the board here, and if I pinch harder, it pushes this way. And if I pinch less, it pulls it back that way. So I'm actually going to let the saw, I'm doing it this way, I let the saw ride against my fingers, and I can push it this way or let it pull back just by how I grab the plate. And I'll let it ride on my thumbnail. Once I get a little curve there. And on this one, I'm actually going to draw a vertical line, because the most important thing on this board is that these be completely, perfectly vertical. And so I'm going to do this just because this one has some wild grain, and my eye might catch that grain and go wild with it. And we don't like going wild around here. Oh, that was off. Let's try. There, that's better. Yeah.
Just,
what's that?
I feel like we're not getting the top of it, of what you're doing.
Oh, am I too close? Oh, sorry. There, let's do that. Thank you. That is why my wife is here. That, and she looks really good. So ratings go up when she's on there. Need to make her video bigger. Okay. I have those in place. Now we can cut down. down to depth. Making sure I cut on the right side of the line. That's why I put the X on top there, so it lets me know you cut on that side of the line, you nincompoop. Yes. You're only a good woodworker if you're good at calling yourself names. Down to depth, a little more. Next cut. And last cut. Wow, that is loud. Cool, so now we need to remove the material in between these, and that is going to feel very much like something we just did, because, well, it is very much something we just did, only on oak rather than walnut. Walnut is a really easy wood to work with, and oak is not. Bring that back into focus. There we go. Questions?
No.
Cool. So when cutting this, I don't want to go straight into the line. I want to actually back off the line a little ways. Usually just about 1/16 inch or so. One light little tap. Then we'll move over and do the same thing next to it. Oh, that came loose. Oh, we're chopping down. Same thing again. And then let's put this in. And then I want to pare out. And so I come in at an angle and chop out. And this oak is particularly stubborn. Which may be one of the reasons why I like oak. I feel like a kinship to it.
Self-reflection when you work.
Yeah. If anyone should know, it's my wife. And some people like to cut these out with a fret saw. I'm not as much of a fan of that. I've tried it several times, but I've never found it to be faster or easier. But personal preference. Especially, I think that's partly because of oak. Oak is just not an easy wood to work with a fret saw. If I were doing this with a normal secondary wood like poplar, in which case then the fret saw works really fast. And chisel is not that much faster than it is with like walnut or something of that nature. I'm going to go in one more pair. So I'm just going to pare this down. I'm kind of putting my body into the back of this. And wiggling it down into place.
You ready for some questions?
Sure.
Alright, so Rafael Acosta says, I made a clock out of Purple Heart, but I have a couple of board feet of it that I didn't need, and I'm trying to decide what I should use it for. Any recommendations on my next handmade project?
Oh, I don't know. Whenever I have a question about projects, I usually do a Google search or Pinterest search, and I will search things that I've recently been interested in or hobbies, and be like, you know, wooden clock or something of that nature. And I'll usually get some ideas that at least get my brain spinning. And usually that answers my question about what am I going to be building. Like, I just got a set of plans for wooden gear clocks. I'm thinking that'd be a really fun project of cutting an entire clock worth of gears all by hand. Once I get my scroll saw up and going. So we got that side. Flip it over. Do the same thing again. What else we got?
Let's see, Jay Stu says, I've been indecisive about where to get my first set of chisels. Any recommendations? I want something good quality but affordable.
Mine are from Aldi, the grocery store. They sell them once a year. So the sale was just like last month. So it's going to be a while till they get those. Cheap and functional. Actually, the wooden handled ones from Harbor Freight. Those are my secondary set. They are cheap. You will end up sharpening them more often than other chisels. But oh well. The more you sharpen, the more you learn how to sharpen. The easier everything becomes. So having to sharpen chisels more often is not a problem. It's part of the skill learning. Other than that, usually my next set then is Narex from Veritas. I like them. They're good. Then they're probably the cheapest of the decent quality chisel. I have quite a few of them, but I like to use these ones from Aldi just to show cheap works well. So, hope that answers your question. If not, you can always go onto my website, woodbywright.com, and /tools. I have a list of all the tools that I recommend or easily purchased. Not the best in the market, but ones that are financially feasible. So, yeah. Cool. Woo! Hold fast slipping. This particular hole, the hold fast in, is slightly too big, so it likes to slide around on me. Almost there. I think one more, and we'll be down close to it. And now I'm actually going to chop in from the end and pop out all that excess in one chunk. Just makes it easier to get at.
Barry Baxter asks, I saw you use a cordless drill in the video. What other power tools do you use?
Well, I mean, in video projects, it's that and a power planer. I have a power planer. I have an entire video on it. It's my one concession to general power tools. Just because roughing out boards is a bit of a pain, so I use that one from time to time. But I mean, I have a lot of power tools. I just don't use them in videos. If I wasn't doing wood by Wright, I'd be far more hybrid and have a table saw and other things. But the videos do better when I just use hand tools.
And Sarah left her car in the garage. She has to work in the winter.
Yeah. The shop is in the basement. And I would not bring my power tools down here. That would be, well, suicide. Yeah, a lot of people think I have some sort of weird beef with power tools, and I don't think people shouldn't use power tools. I've spent more of my life using power tools than hand tools. So, cool. Now we're down through there, and I just need to clean this up. And we will see if this will fit right off the saw or not. Chop that down. That down. What is our time? 39. Yeah, I think we're going to be splitting this up into 2 sessions, and we'll cover the other half next week. Which is a bit sad because that's the half where all the fun is at. This half is basically just cutting a dovetail with a few other alterations. Okay, let's clean this up and see how well this works. How square are we? And got a little cleanup to do there. Well, that was actually really nice. So I'm going to use that, and that'll tell me if there's any burrs or anything on the inside that I need to tease out. Like that. And so I'm trying not to use so much pressure that I blow out the other side. I just want to go in a little ways, and I'll turn the board around and come in from the other side. And unlike regular, I try not to undercut the dovetails. Every now and then, undercutting happens. Like on this one, the chisel went deep right there.
Oh, we can't see.
What's that?
I don't think we can see all that.
Oh, am I still back on that one? Oh, sorry about that. There we go. This one I undercut a little bit back here, but not a huge issue. That should be good. And the reason you don't want to undercut them as much is that you have small pieces of wood that have to have something to be glued to. And if you undercut from both sides, then you end up with almost nothing for the wood to glue to. And one thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring in a file, and I'm just going to clean up these faces a little bit. Because I want these faces to be really smooth so that they get good adhesion. Uh-oh, she's laughing again.
Yeah.
And let's see. Here, let me clean these up too.
Do that and I'll tell you.
And we'll see how well does this actually fit. Chances are it's not, and I'll have to do a good bit of work on it. And this one's actually pretty good. A little tight here. So I'm going to take some material off of this face. Oh!
No.
Chisel on the floor, and it's chipped. Oh well, I'll have to work on that. Such is life.
Good thing it's a 2-part series now.
Well, I don't need that chisel. I'm looking for my other one. Where's my other? Oh, there it is. That's why I always have lots of extra chisels. Well, that's not why, but you know. Clean this out.
That's the reason you tell me.
Yes. I need more chisels, babe, because I keep dropping them. Just paring it down a little bit by little bit. Let's see. How does that fit? It's still a little tight there. Is it tight? Oh, it's tight on the inside of this. So I'm just looking for anything that obviously stands out as, oh yeah, you're rubbing on this, you're rubbing on that. And sometimes you'll actually see when the wood rubs on something, you'll see it like bruising the side, and that will tell you where it needs to be worked on. Another thing you can do is pick up the chisel and tap at it. You see that's a nice sharp crisp. This side, there's more of a dull thud. That lets me know that I'm rubbing here and not here.
Oh, thank you for stopping.
I'm here for you, babe.
It's much louder in person.
Okay, just cleaning out all that junk. See how it fits again. Oh man, why are we so tight? Okay, let's clean a little more off. Don't take off too much too fast. Just take little bit by little bit, and then you can come in and clean up. You take off too much, then you have a sloppy joint and you have gaps. Take off too little, well then you can always come back and take off a little more. See, yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Cool. I can clean that down. See, what I did on this one is I just trimmed down about halfway down on this pin, and that let me know that this was a good fit. And now I can trim the rest of the halfway down at that level that I just created on the top half. And so it should slide all the way down with the same resistance that it had on that top half. Just taking off a little bit. Yeah, there's what I'm looking for. That little squeak. Finishing knot. Tap, tap, tap. And that's where I like my joints to be. Just a little bit more force needed than what my thumbs can put on it. That's what I like. Other people are going to have different amounts that they like, but that's what I like. And so on this, you can see here how I have Make sure I'm in focus. There we are. Good. I have this larger than it needs to be in all directions, and that's perfectly fine. Because in this one here, you can see what I'm going to end up doing is cutting this off, and then I'm going to plane it all back to that. So it being bigger on all sides is not an issue, because I'm going to be then basically returning this board to having a nice square flat end. And we'll be doing that next time. Yeah, 46, so I guess that's about time to call it. Any questions? Or if there are any, if you guys do have any questions, let me know. Usually at the end of these we like to
There was one.
do a little answer, because I'm usually missing a few things like, how did you do that? Or if you have something completely different, go ahead and ask me a
It's a
question.
completely different one. Laura from TheKiddSocks asks, I fall in love with the look of spalted wood, but it is, someone commented no. But it's too tricky, is it too tricky for a beginner to work with because of the softer bits, etc.?
No. Well, every wood is going to have its difficulties. And spalted wood just tends to have some soft, punky areas. But as long as your tools are sharp, it's actually easier to work with. It's like a soft pine. Well, depending upon the wood. Now, if it's really punky, then you're probably going to want to stabilize it somehow. Because if it's really punky, it's just not going to last. It's not going to be something you can work on. But lightly spalted, like maple particularly, is relatively easy to work with. But if you talk about like oak, when it spalts, it gets really punky and soft. You can crush it in your fingers. So in that case, I like to actually impart a resin to it, penetrating resin or something of that nature that will harden it up a bit. And I have a video on wood stabilization if you want to see that as well. For any small piece, wood stabilization is usually the way to go. But bigger pieces, if it's just too punky, it's not a great tool to use, a great wood to use. What else?
Oh, well, all of a sudden we got a bunch of questions, but there was one I think I missed earlier. Someone had asked about if you teach classes, I thought.
I don't normally. I've taught several where someone gives me a call and says, hey, would you come teach a class? And usually as long as the trip is covered, I'll go and do that. I've thought about offering a couple classes around here, but just never gotten around to it. So who knows, maybe in the future I will. We'll see.
Hang on. Well, 63 degrees north just has an issue about hiding tools around the house. You'll have to read that. It's quite interesting. The boys are arguing upstairs. You guys can hear them. John says, hope we do more of these around this time of day. We Brits appreciate it.
Next week we'll be finishing this up at 3 o'clock. So actually we might end up doing it a little bit earlier than 3 o'clock. We'll see.
TBD. Alright, let's see. Bernard Grant Greathouse asks, have you ever tried to work with osage orange wood?
Osage orange, yes. Osage is a very hard wood, but really beautiful. And I've actually gotten to work with Osage green as well, which not too many people know about. But the root ball on the Osage orange tree is green, and I mean really, really, really green. Like forest green. Really cool wood to work with. It feels the exact same as Osage orange. But yeah. But yeah, it's a fun wood to work with. Great for mallets.
Oh, it's a two-part question. I got separated by a comment. So doomducker asks, I have some hardwood that has been kiln dried. It's very dry and brittle, and it's hard to work with on the end grain. I'm trying to make dovetails for drawers. Do you have any tips on how to do this?
Sharper tools, less force, less chunks. In other words, take off less of a bite. So if you're planing it, make it a very thin pass. Low angle, especially on ingrain, the lower angle you can get better. So if you have a low angle block plane, or a low angle like a 62 or a low angle jack plane, there's the word. Those will do ingrain far better. But most of the time it just comes down to taking less chunks off the wood. And so we're taking a smaller bite. A lot of people like to take a really heavy bite, and that is counterproductive. But yeah, those are the most common things. Take less of a bite, and if you're working the end grain, a lower angle works better.
Let's see. Out of breath. Ben Rubin asked, do you find that oak splits more often when tapping the two pieces together?
I'm guessing you're talking about in dovetails like that. No more than any other wood, although I've only had it split apart on me once. I don't even remember what the project was. I mean, the harder the wood, the less it's going to compress and flex, and therefore it's going to crack eventually. And oak particularly tends to be a brittle wood. So yes, oak will probably split more than other woods. But most of the time, the reason it splits is that it's not fitting, and then you go to pound it together. The reason I bring out the mallet is that I know it's going to fit together. I can feel it in my fingers. I can hear the sound of tapping it. Those are slight cues that I've gotten used to. If you're not comfortable with that, or if you find it splitting, then you should get the joint to the point that you can push it together with your fingers and not use any tools, not use any force. And that's that amount of pressure is really good for dovetails. I like it to be just a little bit tighter personally, but that's me. Especially with like walnut. Walnut has a bit of compressiveness to it that it flexes well when you pound it a little more on it. But most of the time it's splitting, it's just because it wasn't fit together quite right. At least in my experience. What you got?
Laura, it's okay.
It's okay.
That she's saying that she has some fears about whether she can do the zero woodworking background thing. And it's all good. There's friends here.
Yeah, everyone starts out at some point. And honestly, for some reason, not for some reason, you're watching YouTube and there are all these perfect joints being done and people just, everything falls together on YouTube. And it gets a bit daunting because you expect that to be what woodworking is. And when you actually get into it, they look horrible and your joints are massive problems. There's a couple reasons for that. Number one, it's actually very hard to show problems on YouTube. It takes extra work to actually show that. Because it's just, you're not in front of you, you're not handling it, and so things disappear. It's very easy to make gaps disappear. And number two, usually the people who are doing things with woodworking have been doing it for a few years, and that's what happens. The more you do something, the better it's going to get. So don't expect your first few tries to be perfect. Don't expect your 100th try to be perfect. There are always going to be problems. And if you come over and look at my house, and come over and look at my joinery in person, you look at it and be like, wow, that looks a lot worse than it did in the video. Because that's reality. That's what woodworking is. When you get down to something and you work on it, and especially if you're the one doing it, you see all the problems, and that's something that just can't be conveyed over video. It's you can't see that until you're in person. So perfection is not a location; it is a direction. Don't assume that because you know how to do it, it will be perfect. No matter how long you've been working at it, you can always get better. Frank Klaus is like the king of dovetails. And if you talk to him, he'll still be saying, yeah, I can still get better at dovetails. I haven't reached perfection. It doesn't exist. It's not. It isn't a location that you can get to. It's just the way you need to eventually go. So don't worry about it. Dive in, have some fun, and be okay with the problems. That's part of the course. If you're not making problems, then you're not learning.
I got deep. I feel like
that's like
I need
the
a cup
core.
of tea and listen to Professor J.
That is the core of this channel. Is life happens. I am not here because I am a fine woodworker. I'm not here because I'm a historical woodworker. I'm here because this is stinking fun, and I love it. I want to bring that joy back to it. I don't want it to be focused on perfection. I want it to be focused on this is fun. This is something that anyone can dive into. Don't worry about being perfect. Just have fun. Enjoy the process.
But you can always be right.
Only if you marry in.
Anyway, I thought there was another question. Don Davis says, I've had a hard time working with oak splitting on me, just trying to cut a mortise into a 4/4 board. Any way to stop that?
I think what you're running into is that you're not reading the grain direction as well. Oak, when you get under the grain, if the grain is rising on you and you're planing this way, it's going to split and tear out. Oak, you've got to be working with the grain, or you've got to have a very finely set tools if you're working against the grain. And so yes, oak does split much easier. I mean, there are other woods that split easier than oak, but if you compare it to like walnut and cherry and maple, those are all very dense, not dense woods. Those are ring diffuse. What's the word? The tiny micro holes are spread evenly throughout the wood. Whereas if you look at oak, you'll see these strings of all of the pores. And so that creates natural weak points in the wood. Or do you laugh?
Nothing.
That creates natural weak points in the wood, so it will split along those lines very easily. But most of the time it just comes down to technique about going with the grain and learning how is it going to split out here, and being ready for it. Especially if it's kiln dried. Kiln dried oak is very fractious, whereas air dried oak tends to be a little more flexible. But good luck finding air dried oak. Anytime I can find it, I snag it up. Good stuff.
I think we're good.
Cool. I think we've come close to the end. So thank you all for hanging around. Next week we will be doing this again at probably 3 o'clock. We might do it at 2 o'clock Central Time. We're going to be leaving on something after that. Then we'll come back and finish up this joint. And that's where the fun happens and it looks really cool. So looking forward to that. I think that'll about do it. Until next time, have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Oh, here's the button, Chase.